My guest tonight is Brandon Martinez. He is an independent journalist from Canada who specializes in foreign policy issues, international affairs, and geopolitics. He has written extensively on Zionism, Israel-Palestine, U.S. and Canadian foreign policy, war, terrorism, and deception in media and politics. His work has appeared on Press TV, Veterans News Now, and other alternative media venues. He is the author of Grand Deceptions and Hidden History. Brandon is also the co-founder of Non-Aligned Media, a web-based news outlet I guess, devoted to alternative news. His blog is martinezperspective.com. Brandon, is that a good intro? Want to add anything there? Did I miss anything?
That sounds perfect. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, great. So, okay, well, article you wrote recently, The War on Conspiracy Realists Continues.
Mm-hmm.
About, I guess, certain laws that have been imposed in the United Kingdom by David Cameron. It gets into some of these, I guess the war on free speech to suppress open debate on some of these issues regarding Israel, Palestine, foreign affairs, international policy. First of all, you said conspiracy realists as opposed to conspiracy theorists. Can you want to go into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the term conspiracy theorist is wielded by establishmentarian academics, so-called, by politicians, by elite media shills to denigrate anybody who has a skeptical viewpoint on geopolitical affairs, right? So if you question official stories or narratives, which are in themselves conspiracy theories, right? Because a conspiracy is simply two or more people getting together in secret to plan a criminal activity, which is, something that gets prosecuted every day in the courts. In any normal functioning justice system, conspiracy is a charge, so it happens all the time. So the suggestion that governments don't do that, I mean, it's obviously a top-down narrative that they want to pursue to cover for themselves. So they've created this term conspiracy theorist, which was essentially fostered back in the 60s by the CIA when people started to question the official story of the JFK assassination, all the impossibilities surrounding that event. So it's been wielded ever since, mainly by Western governments, but also by any government, the Russian government, Chinese government. All governments use this term to try to discredit skeptics and critics of their official narrative. So I refuse to use that term conspiracy theorist. There's nothing wrong with being a theorist. I mean, the scientific method, of course, involves theorizing about things to come to solid conclusions and weighing the evidence. So there's nothing wrong with a theory, and certainly conspiracies happen all the time. So a conspiracy realist just means somebody who recognizes that governments at times conspire behind the scenes to undermine the public good or commit nefarious acts that don't serve the interests of the people, but serve these select few people in the government and business world that benefit from government policies, right? So I think everybody should start using the word conspiracy realist and eschew this epithet, this pejorative term, conspiracy theorist.
Well, yes, that anyone who's bothered to look into these matters, whether it's 9/11, the JFK assassination, the Vietnam War, or just politics in general, knows that politicians get together with lobbyists and special interests, and they do conspire. Conspire means just to breathe the same air, but
Right.
they do conspire against the people. That's what lobbying is all about. Well, that's why there are 10 lobbyists for every, or 100 lobbyists for every congressman in Washington D.C. And you can probably say the same thing about, in Canada and also in the UK.
Mhm.
So it's not, you don't have to be a crackpot to to believe in that. I mean,
Right.
that's common sense. But obviously, when you get into some of the article you wrote about was, I guess, efforts made by the British Prime Minister David Cameron
Mhm.
to
So the
stifle
British
free
Prime
speech.
Minister, if we remember back in September of last year, call drop there.
Oh, sorry,
What
sorry,
was that?
I lost you.
Yeah. When did
Just
you lose me?
when you said the British Prime Minister last year.
Okay.
So, so
Yeah, my internet's sometimes shady. Okay. So you're recording?
Yeah, I'm still recording. That isn't Canadian intelligence doing it to it, is it?
It could be. Yeah, never know. Um, so yeah, the British Prime Minister last year in September gave an Orwellian speech at the United Nations where he called for the criminalization of conspiracy theorists. He essentially compared conspiracy theorists or people specifically, he said, who believe that 9/11 was an inside job or a Zionist plot are akin to ISIS terrorists, and he called for the British government to crack down on such people. So he's essentially following through on these threats that he made last year. And what this amounts to is a sustained campaign that I've noticed happening, and I've been writing about since this whole ISIS scare has taken over the media. Since about 2013, 2014, this whole ISIS fiasco in the Middle East, which obviously I've written a lot about how Western governments themselves created ISIS in the first place, just as they created Al-Qaeda to fight the Russians, and they've used these people as geopolitical cannon fodder to fight in various battle zones where Western or Zionist geopolitical interests are at stake. So they've created this ISIS boogeyman, and now that they've created it and used it to attack governments that they don't like, specifically Libya and Syria, now they're using the image that they've created of ISIS, this boogeyman image, this terror group that is chopping people's heads off, and they're everywhere. They're like these elusive boogeymen that pop up everywhere, and they're on Twitter, and they have all this prowess. Of course, all this is done with the full support and backing of Western intelligence. So this is a Hegelian dialectic. They control both sides of this. They created ISIS, and they're still using ISIS to assail their enemies in the Middle East and to carry out this agenda of divide and conquer. But at the same time, they're using their own creation as an excuse to take away our civil liberties, to convince the populations of the West to consent to the extirpation of their rights and freedoms, such as specifically freedom of speech. So it's very Orwellian. It's just a total gambit that they're running here. I mean, while they're supporting ISIS clandestinely, they are simultaneously in the media demonizing their own bad guys that they've created, that they still continue to fund as a way of executing this other agenda of removing critics of the war on terror, critics of organized Zionism, critics of these lunatic foreign policies that they've been pursuing since 9/11 and even before that. So David Cameron, in his efforts to stamp out conspiracy theorists, he's actually unveiled several things that he's going to do. For example, he said that he's going to give parents the ability to revoke passport of their children. He's going to give the police powers to vet what, quote, conspiracy theorists or extremists, quote unquote, post on social media. He's going to give power to Ofcom, which is the telecommunications regulatory agency, to eliminate television programs that broadcast things that they don't like. So this is all done under the banner of fighting extremism, fighting terrorism. This is just an Orwellian ruse to cover over the fact that they are behind the terrorists, that they are facilitating this and just using it against people in the Middle East, but also against us here in the West. So, I mean, this is pretty much happening across the board in the West. It's not just Britain. I mean, this is not something that's new. Stephen Harper in Canada is pushing for very similar measures. He just passed Bill C-51, an anti-terrorism bill, which effectively does the same thing. It gives the intelligence agencies carte blanche to tap phones and spy and detain and arrest without any charge. And it's all being done under the guise of fighting ISIS, but anyone who's learned in geopolitics and history understands that they do this all the time. They did it back in the 80s to fund these fundamentalists to fight the Russian enemy in Afghanistan, and they're essentially doing a rerun of that policy today. Effectively, the same players are involved. Israel, the U.S., and their proxies in Saudi Arabia have cultivated this ISIS group to serve the purpose of destabilizing first Libya, and then they've moved on to Syria, and then they'll move on to Iran. And that's part of this neocon, 7 countries in 5 years plan, which was unveiled after 9/11. So this is just a duplicitous double game that they're playing. It's something that's been happening for a while now.
And of course, with David Cameron, he says that if you do the research and you bother to inform yourself on these issues, and you point out the fact that the so-called ISIS group has being supported by the Gulf states and NATO, operating out of Turkey, and you're pointing out that these governments are supporting this terrorist organization, he'll call you the terrorist for making that accusation.
It's completely bizarre, you know. He's he's the one that's actually supporting this organization. As I go through in the article here, there's plenty of evidence that the British government is fully complicit with this mainly U.S. Israeli plan to facilitate these extremists and terrorists in their entry into Syria to overthrow Assad. So, we had there was a trial recently. One of the things I bring up is this trial of this Swedish guy in Britain. And part of his defense, they accused him of fighting for one of these militant groups in Syria affiliated with ISIS. And when his lawyers come in and said, well, look here, the British government themselves have been supporting the same opposition groups, the same militant groups that our client here was working with. So how can you charge a man for working with a group that you are also working with? So they actually dropped the charges on this guy, fearing that more evidence would come out. Of course, there was the Seymour Hersh, award-winning journalist from the U.S., he wrote this article called The Red Line and the Rat Line, and he went through how the CIA and the MI6 were running this arms smuggling ring through Benghazi in Libya. So if people remember back in 2011, the West and NATO started bombing Libya in support of Al-Qaeda-linked militants and rebels that they had clandestinely been arming and financing, partially through the Gulf states of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. That's sort of a gambit that's used for plausible deniability, which Seymour Hersh even said in the article that they were going to do it through those regimes. They'll do weapons transfers through them so that that they're not, that CIA and MI6 can then claim that they're not directly involved when clearly they are. So they were running this rat line of weapons that they'd pilfered from the Gaddafi regime after it fell, and they were moving these guns into Syria to arm the Western-backed militant groups there, which effectively is ISIS. In fact, the same rebel groups that the West was supporting in Libya have now declared themselves to be ISIS. It's all under the same banner. So this group called ISIS is nothing more than a Western Israeli intelligence operation to take down the remaining impediments to this imperium that Israel wanted to see happen in the Middle East. Going back to the 80s, the Israelis had been calling for the breakup, the balkanization of all of its surrounding enemies. Lebanon and Iraq and Syria were specifically named as prime targets for this, and obviously Iran. And then, they replicated those ideas in numerous think tank reports like the Clean Break strategy report put out in 1996 by Richard Pearl and Feith and other neocons, and that was for an Israeli think tank as advice to Netanyahu, and they reiterated the same kind of thing. They said, we want to overthrow Saddam Hussein as a starting point, as a prelude to weakening Syria and then weakening Iran. So this is all about breaking down the remaining countries that have some semblance of independence from this American Zionist imperium, right? See, ISIS doesn't attack any country that is already on side with this Western Zionist imperium or is more or less controlled by it. So the Gulf states are not being attacked by ISIS. Turkey is not being attacked by ISIS, although there was an attack recently, but that was actually on the Kurdish group, which Turkey is on side with attacking anyway. Jordan is not being attacked. All the governments that have already been co-opted or controlled by the West/Israel, they're not being attacked by ISIS, and Israel itself has never been attacked by ISIS. In fact, ISIS even said in a social media post that they are not concerned with Israel and they have no interest in fighting Israel, and that they're more interested in attacking, quote, Muslim infidels and other Muslims. It doesn't make any sense logically why that would be, but it does make sense logically when you realize that ISIS is this acquiescent tool of U.S.-Israeli foreign policy. So, in this article, I go over some of the evidence that has come out. Seymour Hersh, again, he wrote a report back in 2007, way before all of this stuff happened. And he reported on how the Bush administration, in conjunction with Israel and Saudi Arabia, had formed a new partnership, and they took on a new strategic direction aimed at combating Shiite influence, the Shiite Muslim influence, which emanates obviously from Iran, from Syria, and Hezbollah. These are the main impediments of Israel in the Middle East. The rest of these countries in the Middle East, the Sunni majority states, have more or less been co-opted or are under the control of the U.S. or Israel. Made peace deals with Israel at like Egypt and Jordan, or are in league with the West and are doing all kinds of business with the West, such as the Gulf states and the oil industry. So that really spells out what this whole ISIS thing is all about. I mean, Sir Hersh talks about how the Saudis guaranteed Israel's security. They said, we control the Wahhabi Salafi groups, these fanatics that formed ISIS. And they said, we control these groups. We're not concerned with these groups doing terrorism in the Middle East. We want them to do terrorism. We want them to throw bombs, just not at Israel, just not at us in Saudi Arabia, and just not at any Western interest, but at the Shiites, at Iran, at Hezbollah, and Syria. And Hersh even says that the aim was to weaken the government of Assad. And this was back in 2007. So this was long before ISIS even was on the radar. So, and he's outlining how they specifically intended to finance Sunni extremist groups to do this. So, while they're doing this, while they're running this bizarre Machiavellian gambit in the Middle East to destroy various countries, to weaken them, to harm their populations, on top of the sanctions that already exist that is punishing these countries economically, they're using these terrorists to wreak havoc, but then they're using the fear of these groups from naive people in the West who don't understand this, who don't research geopolitics, and it's just all this stuff is done under the table, so it's almost impossible for your average citizen to ascertain these facts unless they do research, unless they read about these things. So the majority of the population is never going to be aware of these hidden dealings, these under-the-table schemes. So they just believe, that this stuff is all completely organic, that this group just came up out of nowhere, armed themselves to the teeth out of nowhere, they're just financing themselves magically, this is all just magically happening organically and independently of state sponsorship, which obviously is a fantasy. So the average person is just seeing these horrors unfolding, is seeing the images, the terrible videos that have been coming out, and they're frightened by this, and this is being exploited and capitalized on by Western governments to obviously pass laws that would ultimately criminalize people like me, people like you, or anybody else who's questioning and criticizing these insane foreign policies. They would effectively criminalize us, and they claim to be doing it under the banner of fighting ISIS's supporters, but this is just a lie. This is just a ruse. This is sort of a PR sleight of hand. What they're really after is people who support Hezbollah, people who support Iran, or people who support Syria. Those are the people they really want to go after. It's the people who are against Israeli imperialism and Zionism and have been critiquing that. ISIS is their thing. It's their creation. They run it. They control it. So they're not concerned with people who are these naive people who actually like ISIS for whatever reason. They're not concerned about those people. That's just the veneer that they've created. They're going to go after a couple people that are sympathizers with ISIS, this false flag group that they've created, but that's ultimately just a smokescreen for the real agenda, which is to go after anti-Zionists, anti-globalists, people like that. Those are the real target of this agenda.
And if you look at a map and look what's going on, obviously ISIS and what it's perpetrating in Syria, they're serving Anglo-American Israeli interests. So if you just take a step back and look at that, then you can infer from that what's going on. It would be like, as you mentioned, just a question where they're getting all the support, where they're getting these fleet of Toyota trucks, how they're able to drive across the desert without being molested by U.S. air power, NATO air power.
Right.
But this is an old strategy. I mean, the notion of the false flag, that goes way back. Israeli history was founded upon that, whether it's the King David bombing, the Lavon affair, the 67 war, which was, history treats it as, it was sparked by, it was really started by Israel. And you have, with the U.S., I guess you could go back to their not overt support, but anyone who does the history knows their support for Wahhabi or Muslim extremists goes back to at least 1979 with Operation Cyclone. But the British MI6, that's an old strategy, right? I mean, that's of promoting extremism in the Middle East in order to divide and conquer, right?
Yeah, I think the Americans started supporting it, like you said, in '79 under the Operation Cyclone, which was a destabilization plot to draw the Soviets into Afghanistan and bog them down in a Vietnam-style war. It was a Cold War gambit. The British, though, there's this old document. It's from, I think, the 1800s, which seems to suggest that the British imperial government was instrumental in helping to create Wahhabism, this sort of sectarian, puritanical cult that was formed in the 18th century. So when people, the media loves to just broad brush the whole issue and just say, this is Islam, like the ISIS, this is what Islam is at its core. That's obviously false. This Wahhabi movement is an 18th century invention. It's fairly recent, and it stems from Saudi Arabia, which was propped up in its infancy by the British government. It's a recent creation. This regime in Saudi Arabia, which has spread this Wahhabi Salafi sectarian lunatic ideology, which is far more comparable to Zionism or extremist Jewish fundamentalism, which looks upon non-Jews as goyim or inferior people as opposed to the chosen people as they see themselves. So it's more in line with extremist fundamentalist Judaism than more mainstream branches of Islam and Shiite and Sunni and Sufi Islam, which are the main victims and targets of the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis attack only pretty much Muslims and Christians and others, and they certainly aren't going after Israel in any way, shape, or form. So we obviously see this burgeoning alliance between the Wahhabi and the Zionists. So it's basically one congruent thing now. It's a Wahhabo-Zionism, we could call it, as a new strategy, a new alliance that's been formed in the Middle East to break up and break down the true elements of resistance in that region. So the media likes to just broad brush it all as Islam. They refuse to hone in on that particular strain, because then people will look into the history of it and find that particular cult has been cultivated, has been supported and fostered from its infancy by Western imperial powers who sought to divide and conquer that region back under the Ottoman Empire days during that rivalry. So if you look across the board, all these different groups that espouse that doctrine, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever, these groups are clandestinely being supported by Western intelligence. It's always been the case, and it continues to be the case that particular breed fanatical breed of Islam is a tool, is a prop that's used by the West, by much larger powers as cannon fodder. See, those people are being blown to bits. You know, they're just there to serve the empire, to do the dirty work on the ground, and then they'll just be disposed of at a later date. I mean. These people are as if, some people act as if this is like the head of the snake. I mean, these people wouldn't even exist in their present form without that financial largesse that's coming in, without the weaponry that's being flooded into there, without the logistical support, the training, the arming. If you take that stuff away, there's no such thing as ISIS, and it didn't even exist until a few years ago when they started clandestinely backing it back in 2007 under the Bush administration's auspices. So, that has to be pointed out, and that's something that obviously the mainstream media just doesn't want to talk about, right?
And here in the States, we've had a number of incidences, shootings, where the media tries to say it's either ISIS inspired or ISIS linked, although they provide no evidence to back that up. But they're trying to use that as a pretext to, clamp down here and spread the fear. And that's Wesley Clark made a recent appearance. This recent shooting in Chattanooga, this
Right.
When he fired some shots at a recruitment center that went to a training center and allegedly shot up some people, took some lives, and he apparently is ISIS inspired.
Well, that's the new
Yeah.
thing. It's funny to me because even if it was ISIS inspired, well, that effectively traces back to CIA or Mossad or
Yeah.
MI6 anyway. So even if it is ISIS, well, that's them anyway. So they should be the ones who are held to account for that. And it seems they're switching gears from doing large scale terrorist false flags like 9/11 and 7/7 in Madrid and these bigger bombings because of the burgeoning truth movement, because skeptical people have investigated those events, have effectively debunked those narratives using science, using reason, using logic. And internet sleuths have just totally picked apart those narratives. So they've moved away from the large scale attacks like that, and they've gone to these small scale shooting incidents. So you notice in Ottawa and last year you had the Ottawa shooting, in Sydney you had that shooting, you had the one in France, the Charlie Hebdo, you had the one in Copenhagen, and you had a few other small ones in the U.S. So they've moved from large-scale bombings, which can be easily dissected once you look at the scientific evidence, because it's hard to conceal the type of explosive that's used. It's very easy to prove that didn't do the damage, right? So they claim, like in the Oklahoma City bombing, for example, they claimed it was a fertilizer truck, and if you just do the math on it and what a fertilizer bomb damage can do, it's certainly nothing like the damage that you saw to the building. So it's hard for them to conceal a false flag when a bomb is involved, because there's the logistical aspects of the attack can be shown to only be able to emanate from intelligence and people with professional skills. So they've gone to these shootings because it's harder to debunk shootings, because how do you prove that this guy was working for the intelligence and that he knowingly was doing that? And obviously there's probably elements of mind control involved in some of these things. I mean, if you go back to MK Ultra project under the auspices of the CIA, I mean, mind control, it sounds a little crazy, but it's definitely a real thing that exists, and they've been experimenting with that for a long time. So there's some of that involved, but if you look at the shooters in all of these incidents, all of them have familiar background details. They're all, relatively poor people. They're involved in shady drug business. They have criminal records. Most of them, in fact, almost all of them, the ones that I've looked into. So, and all of them were well known to the intelligence agencies and were being monitored by the intelligence in every single case. So to me, that is the rap sheet of a patsy, someone who's known to the authorities, who has innumerable weaknesses that can be exploited. So he's either a drug addict or he's got mental issues, etc., etc. It's always these very vulnerable people that can be manipulated or coerced or cajoled into doing something, right? So it's how hard could it be to have an undercover agent convince some mentally ill guy or guy who's addicted to drugs to go on a shooting rampage. It can't be that hard, and I think that is basically what we see happening here. We see the intelligence agencies behind the scenes using informants, which the FBI and the MI6 have been caught doing over and over again. They use informants to entrap people, to coerce people to do things. They troll these mosques for any hothead they can find, anyone who's vulnerable and weak and can be manipulated. And then they provide those people with everything that they need, all the resources they need to carry out the attack. The gun, the bullets, the logistical aid. They're just walked into this thing, and then that connection is completely blacked out in the media. They never report on it. None of these mainstream media outlets are trustworthy. They are just mouthpieces of the state. They don't ask any good questions. They do not investigate these things. They don't ask even simple logical questions. If these intelligence agencies since 9/11 have been empowered to the point where they can tap everybody's phone, the NSA has got us all under surveillance. They can run surveillance on anybody without even a warrant. Yet at the same time, all these attacks keep happening. How is it that they have all this power, unlimited power, that should be able to prevent these things, but then they can't do it? So why would we give you more power? It's like this extreme Orwellian delusional thing that they're running. So they can't stop these attacks, but then they demand more power so that in the future they possibly can. It's just like a never-ending cycle of power grabbing. It's like, oh, another attack's happened. We need more power. We need a new bill for anti-terrorism, and we need more police, and we need more intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a scam for bolstering the state and its power. That's all it is.
That, of course, how that works out, how that relationship works out, is detailed rather well in Trevor Arison's book, The Terror Factory, regarding the American FBI Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Right. He documents hundreds of cases where FBI informants are the primary cause of these so-called terror plots. That if you take away the FBI informant, you're left with nothing. There is no plot. The people that are caught up in these entrapment schemes are effectively just fools, just dupes, just complete idiots that they find on the street and set them up in these silly sting operations that happened here in Canada recently. A couple out in British Columbia, they were surrounded by RCMP undercover agents who were prodding them, who were encouraging them to come up with an attack scenario. They were saying, they were even suggesting the type of explosives to use. They were suggesting targets. I mean, that's entrapment. That is not a real event. I mean, it's a pure fabrication. And then the media just uses this as more scaremongering fodder to convince the public, we're under threat. There's these lone people, these lone wolves everywhere out to get you and out to kill you. And then it's ultimately just used and funneled into bolstering support for this fake coalition that claims to be fighting ISIS but isn't really doing that, is effectively just using that as an excuse and a pretext to attack, again, Syria, to attack the Iraqi government, which aligned with Syria, to attack Iran clandestinely. So they say, we're fighting a war against ISIS, while they took out Saddam Hussein back in 2003. In a couple months, they overthrew his regime, and he had to go hide in a hole in the ground. And he had a powerful army, he had a powerful regime, and the U.S. took him down in a matter of months. They took out Gaddafi. in a matter of months, and he had quite a formidable security force built around him. So how is it possible that 60 coalition countries, including the United States, the most powerful country in the world, that outspends all other nations combined in military, are unable to defeat ISIS? This is simply a complete comical joke. It is utterly impossible to suggest that all of these advanced, sophisticated air forces just can't defeat these people. There's got to be no more than 50 to 60,000 fighters in ISIS. Probably less than that. Probably more like 30,000. And you have 60 Western countries, and then you have Iran, Syria, and the Iraqi government and Hezbollah also actually fighting against ISIS and taking the brunt of the casualties in the fight against ISIS. So how is it that ISIS's name isn't defeated yet? It doesn't make any sense if we believe that they're actually trying to bomb ISIS. It's simply not possible. So what we can ascertain from that is that they're not actually bombing ISIS. When they say they are, they're not. They're actually bombing Iraqi soldiers and militias fighting ISIS. They're actually bombing Syrian soldiers who are fighting ISIS. Israel has bombed several Syrian military sites throughout this insurgency since 2012. They've just did another attack on a brigade of Hezbollah fighters in the Golan Heights in January and killed dozens of Hezbollah fighters. They are not fighting ISIS. I mean, you see the videos of ISIS in their Humvees, in their tanks, who are doing parades in the streets of these cities that they take over. They're out in the open. Everybody can see them. And why isn't the U.S. just annihilating them right there? They're right in the open, but the U.S. has not, and as far as I can tell, has not done any significant bombing runs against ISIS. And there's certainly is evidence that they have attacked Iraqi forces. There's videos of Iraqi soldiers who are saying specifically that we were just bombed by Western coalition planes. They just took out 20 Iraqi soldiers the other month. And at the same time, there's reports coming out of Iraq and Syria that Western planes are dropping weapons to ISIS, continue to drop weapons to ISIS, caches of supplies and weapons, and this is all done clandestinely, and the Western media just doesn't report it. They just don't report these things. The only way you can get this information if you go to Middle Eastern sources like Press TV and stuff like that. So I was on a show recently, and the guy was saying to me, after I said they're not actually bombing ISIS, he suggested that the U.S. has bombed ISIS. They claim that they've killed 9,000 ISIS fighters. They claim they've run thousands of sorties against ISIS. If that was true, it would clearly be the case that ISIS would be faltering. They would be losing ground. They would be crumbling if that were the case, if they're being wiped out by the thousands in Western airstrikes. Why is it that they've actually increased in strength since the coalition began? They've gained more territory in Syria. They've gained more territory in Iraq. They've even gained strength in the Egyptian Sinai, and they've taken over other areas. So the idea that the West is bombing ISIS, yet they continue to grow. I mean, this coalition began last September or August. So it's been almost a year since this so-called anti-ISIL coalition began, yet ISIS is still there. They're still fighting. They're still killing people. They're still taking over large parts and chunks of Syria despite that. So obviously, anyone who looks at this logically can see that it's utter garbage that the West is fighting ISIS. They are not fighting ISIS.
Well, yeah, I think what's going on there is ISIS is obviously a proxy force for NATO and the Gulf states. And in the process, they're using that as a pretext to bomb, destroy the infrastructure of Syria. And that goes towards this idea of breaking up these states into microstates that could be easily manipulated and controlled by Israel or the Western powers, which goes back to the original plan you mentioned. Is that the Odon-Yanan plan or something?
Yeah, the Odon-Yanan was the Israeli geopolitical strategist who in 1982 openly came out and said that our goal from the Zionist perspective was to weaken, to break down, and balkanize the surrounding countries surrounding Israel in order to provide Israel a way to carve out an imperium without much resistance. And he says things like every kind of inter-Arab conflict and confrontation is beneficial to us in the short run, to in our larger strategy of breaking them down along sectarian lines, along the ethnic lines and religious lines. And that's what we see ISIS doing, right? They've cut right through the heart of Syria, through the heart of Iraq, splitting them off from their patrons in Iran, and they've trying to establish their own little quote unquote caliphate in the heart of these countries. And that's exactly what that Ode Dinan thing called for. It spoke of a Sunni state, an Alawite state in Syria, and a Druze state in Iraq. It called for partitioning into three of Iraq along Kurdish, Shia, and Sunni lines. And that's what ISIS is doing, is literally living out the Ode Dinan plan to a T. You can't make this stuff up. This is it's like it's like a geopolitical chess game, and they've conceived these strategies going back decades, and they're quite patient with it. They realize that it's difficult to do these things in a matter of a few years. The war on Iran, of course, was planned years ago. That was something that was on the list of that Wesley Clark came out with, the 7 countries in 5 years. Iran was certainly on that list, and they wanted to go into Iran years ago. But I think what happened was there was just too much exposure of the neocon plan. I mean, the Truth Movement, the 9/11 Truth Movement, I think that really slowed that down. I think they realized that too many people are aware of false flags now. False flag is used to be an obscure term, but now it is very much in the vocabulary of normal everyday people who have been researching and looking into these conspiracies such as 9/11. So that they're having to come up with more and more elaborate ruses like ISIS to justify this, and they're getting away with it. They've been quite successful with this fake ISIS campaign to not only ruin Syria, ruin Libya, use it against Iran, but they've also obviously have been successful in using the threat, the fake manufactured threat of this group that they control, as a means of silencing debate here.
Well, yeah, they can basically, it's a strategy of tension, where if you can terrorize the populace into embracing the state for protection, you can also make the excuse for shutting down free speech or open dialogue on these issues, because either you're with us or against, either you're with the terrorist or with us. That's kind of the dialectic they want to create there.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the Bush doctrine. He said you're either with us or with the terrorists. That doesn't really make sense, since the Bush administration and the neocons who controlled it were behind 9/11.
Yeah.
The 9/11 attacks were merely a pretext, a catalyzing event that they had been yearning for years, as laid out in the Project for the American Century, that would be used to ignite a clash of civilizations. And that this ISIS group, amazingly, in their own magazine, they even have a magazine, they've reiterated this clash of civilizations scenario themselves. They've said that. They actually quoted Bush as saying that. So they're promoting the exact same agenda as the neocons. The ISIS group is just a mouthpiece for the neocon Zionist clash of civilizations agenda. It is almost surreal, to the point where this is like a comedy show. Their videos that they produce are Hollywood caliber. I mean, the idea that these ragtag militants can run around the desert and they're fighting an insurgency in Syria, but at the same time they have the prowess, they have the resources to make Hollywood quality videos. I mean, this stuff, literally, if you go watch some of their videos, their execution videos, it's like a Hollywood movie. Like they have the angles perfect. They got the slow mo going. It's incredible, and it's simply a testament to the fact that this group is pure PR. It is being run out of Langley. It's being run out of Tel Aviv. These videos are manufactured just for the public's consumption to scare everybody into going along with this clash of civilizations. So these things all tie together, right? I mean, you can't really talk about present day occurrences in the Middle East with this ISIS nonsense and not link it back to 9/11 and the neocon agenda. It is the same continuous, congruent agenda, and it's the same strategies and modus operandi that they've used for decades. This is all about deceiving people. This is the masters of deception, war by deception. That's the motto of the Israel Intelligence Agency. They trick people into wars, into conflicts, into fighting each other while they rule the roost, while they are laughing at us as we're all fighting each other and breaking down our countries, and they're just strengthening themselves. So I mean, it's something that is it's kind of depressing for average people to hear about this stuff. It's obviously extremely deleterious to the interests of average people, and most people just don't really want to look into this stuff too deeply. It's too depressing, it's too scary. The fact that this stuff is actually happening, that these crazy people are running our governments into the ground, it's just too much for people to handle sometimes.
Well, I think David Cameron specifically mentioned those who would peddle theories about, I guess, Zionist or Jewish conspiracies.
Right.
About Jewish influence, and he said it basically. It's talking about people who would, peddle theories regarding Jewish influence over foreign policy. Well, that's the elephant in the room, because I don't think anyone who isn't informed anyone who isn't halfway informed cannot deny the fact that that Jewish interest or Zionist interest hold a disproportionate sway over the foreign policy of many Western governments. I mean, that's obvious. I mean,
well, when you look at these 26 standing ovations that were given to Benjamin Netanyahu when he gave a speech in Congress, I mean, that spells it out for you. 26 standing ovations to a foreign head of state. Name me one other country, one other head of state that's ever received more than 2 standing ovations or 1 standing ovation giving a speech in the U.S. Congress. There's simply no other nation on earth that gets that kind of groveling, fawning treatment. It's the same in Canada. Stephen Harper, he's pledged his loyalty, undying support to Israel. He goes to Israel and he even says he was ashamed to be a Canadian because we didn't go into the Iraq War, which was effectively an Israeli war. So these people are traitors. They are puppets. They are tools of the Zionist agenda. They do not serve the interest of Canadians or Americans or Britons. They serve the interest of a foreign power, of the rich and the powerful in their country, which is disproportionately Zionist more and more. And David Cameron, just inadvertently, he is simply confirming what we already suspect. For him to come out and specifically say that he is going after people who draw attention to Zionist influence in the foreign policy of Western governments, that just spells it out. That his script that he's reading from could have been written in Tel Aviv, and might as well have been written in Tel Aviv, because he is looking out for the interests of Zionists, not British people, and obviously that is coming to fruition in the expression of his foreign policy, which is on side with all of this madness in the Middle East. And this kind of coincides also with this group that formed in I think in 2011. It's called the Conference to Combat Anti-Semitism, something to that effect. It was convened several years ago. And they had a conference recently where they called for a global hate law to criminalize anti-Semitism, what they called anti-Semitism. And Western diplomats go to this conference. Heads of technology companies like Google and Facebook and other internet brands go to this conference, and it's effectively an Israeli government-sponsored conference, and they called for the censorship of the internet. They call for removing of any websites critical of Israel, so-called Holocaust deniers, opponents of Zionism. And they even went so far as to call for an international global framework to be created that would afford them the power through the United Nations somehow to go into these sovereign states and sweep up the quote anti-Semites. An anti-Semite is just somebody who's criticizing Zionist criminality, right? Anybody who doesn't want to subordinate the interests of their own country to the interest of Israel. That's what an anti-Semite is. It's not someone who just irrationally hates all Jews for no reason. That's just a straw man argument. It's clearly what they're doing that's causing people to dislike them, right? So they're really moving towards this sort of one world global framework. They're not satisfied with how various governments have been allowing criticism unfettered, specifically in America. Europe and Canada and Australia have laws in the books that can be used to prosecute dissidents, but America doesn't have those yet. So they're hoping to implement a global government that would obviously allow them to, put any dissidents, anyone who's critical of them, in effectively gulags. That's what we're heading to. We're heading to a one world totalitarian state controlled by them. And it's doom and gloom, but I think that when you recognize that that's happening and all of these things are connected and you don't speak out about it and you just ignore it, I mean, that's tacit complicity in my opinion. I think you have to raise your voice when you see injustice going on, when you see all these evil things happen in the world, and you don't voice your opinion about it. You're either just cowardly or complicit with it. So that's why I would encourage everybody who's aware of this, who's learned about this in recent years, because the internet has been, a great tool for the dissemination of information. People need to take their knowledge and start speaking out about it more fervently than they have.
And we have to, when you're talking about this, when you're talking about the Jewish lobby or the Jews or the Zionists, you're talking about the Jews as a political entity. It's the same way when we say Germans. Germans invaded Poland. We speak in these terms because we have to speak in generalities when we're talking about these categories. It isn't to say that every person who's Jewish is involved in this, but we're talking about the Jewish elite, these billionaires and their politicians and the people they control. That's what we're talking. That's when we speak of Jewish power. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about their control of the media, and they admit they do have a disproportionate influence in the media. You want to call it control? I'd say it's enough that you could call it control, because if you look at the themes that come out of Hollywood and entertainment, they do support a certain narrative of history, which creates the guilt in the West, which creates the contempt that many feel towards I guess you could say, the Gentile West, enables people to be manipulated and cowed by this powerful lobby. The Holocaust narrative was central to this because that's how they were able to sort of win a sort of moral coup over Western civilization. And, yeah. Without getting into the disputes regarding the true nature of the so-called Holocaust, the fact that they're willing to shut down debate, they want to destroy the First Amendment, free speech. They want to imprison people who dare just to question it and hold it to some sort of standard analysis. And to me, that's an admission that there's something wrong with their narrative.
Well, the old saying goes, ridicule or coercion is the refuge of the out-argued, people who don't have an argument, who don't have the facts, who don't have evidence. If they had the evidence, the facts, the truth on their side, there would be absolutely no need to imprison people, to demonize them in the media, to persecute them. So obviously they have lost the argument, and they've resorted to force. in order to stifle those who have stumbled upon the truth and are not fearful about the repercussions of speaking that truth. So that's what lies behind Holocaust denial laws. That's what lies behind hate speech laws. They're not satisfied with, like you said, the control of the media. They're not satisfied with that. They can have 80% control of the media. They want 100% control. They're not satisfied with just having a marginal minority who are wise to what they're doing, who understand what's going on, who are voicing opinion. They don't want anybody talking about it. They want complete acquiescence to their agenda. They're never satisfied with the level of economic, political clout that they do have, that they do wield. They're the most privileged class in the world, right? In every country, they have special rights, special privileges. The politicians bending over backwards, genuflecting at the altar of Israel, and that's not enough for them. It's almost as if they have messianic ideas about global hegemony, and that's something that is existent in the Old Testament, something I've written about in my book, Grand Deceptions and Hidden History. There are these doctrines in the Old Testament that does prophecy global hegemony of Jews, of what it says in the Old Testament is the quote chosen people, and that's a supremacist and racist concept. That you're chosen above all other people to dominate and subordinate and control and accrue the wealth and riches of the world. This is something that is spoken about openly in these Old Testament doctrines. These are supremacist doctrines. That's what we're criticizing. We're not saying every Jew believes in that or is part of that or is a supremacist. There are Jews that have spoken against that, who have criticized that, who have come out, like Benjamin Friedman was a great truth teller of Jewish background who unveiled a lot of truth about World War II. So there are dissidents that are speaking out about this in their own community. So we're against the supremacist elements that have hijacked that group, that dominate that group, that have accrued all this wealth and that have a nefarious agenda. It's not simply that they just want to have this state for themselves in the Middle East and just be good neighbors. That's not what they're doing. They want to expand, they want to control, and they want to dominate. And they're doing it by manipulating us in the West into doing a lot of it for them.
And Chris, we're talking about we're talking about the Sheldon Adelsons of the world, the George Soroses, and these people. And
right, these are the billionaires,
yeah,
the oligarchs, the financiers.
And oligarchs act like oligarchs. It's almost we're not saying every person who is Jewish is guilty of this, but many of them are fooled, just like as many Christians are by this. But the billionaires, I think, you could say, probably by virtue of their station in life, believe in this supremacy and the ruthlessness that they employ to carry out their agenda.
Well, they control their own people through propaganda, and I would encourage people to watch that film. It's called Defamation. It's
I've seen that.
An Israeli, and just the level and the intensity of the brainwashing of Jews in Israel is incredible.
They're traumatized,
right?
And that's one thing a lot of people want to hear when they're criticizing Zionist or the Jewish lobby is the recognition that the rank and file Jew is often traumatized and frightened. He generally thinks this. So, in a sense, they're victimized as well, and that's a level of sensitivity when we're talking about these things. We have to talk because we are dealing with human beings here with feelings and interests,
right.
And so how they're convinced that they're only a minute away from a pogrom.
Right.
How that movie Defamation, how I guess it's the Mossad agent, Israeli intelligence agent, who's convincing them that all the Poles want to kill them.
Right.
Yeah. And it was a Jew who made that film, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So
right. Yeah. So, it's something that has to be overcome, even from within their own communities. And then this is what Gilad Atzmon, the Israeli dissident, has been doing, and he's called for just a reformation within their own societies to shed this supremacist outlook, this paranoid mind control that has been foisted upon them, which of course is manifesting in today's geopolitical situation. That Israel acts like an irrational lunatic state, and that's sort of an expression of the internal paranoia that's embedded within the people in that country. Their foreign policy, as irrational as it is just an expression of that. So it has to start at an individual level for there to be a broader awakening and change.
Yeah. And of course, it's a state that won't define its own borders, yet it's allowed to be a member of the United Nations.
Right.
So, well, listen, I want to thank you for coming on tonight. It's a great article. Again, your website is Non-Aligned Media. And is that nonalignedmedia.com?
That's right.
And
nonalignedmedia.com.
And your partner there is Joshua Blankney?
Yeah, Josh Blakely, me and him run that website. I also have another blog called Martinez Perspective, which is just a repository of all my articles.
Okay.
And obviously my books are up there.
Well, listen, yeah, you can get the books. So, listen, thank you for coming on tonight. Maybe we'll have you on again, soon when I see another article that gets my attention.
Thanks.
Worthy of talking about. Again, it's it's an important subject, a very sensitive subject. I think you handled it well tonight. Explaining your views and how it should be discussed, how it should be handled. It's basically we're dealing with I guess fifth columnist and an outside and a foreign government which seeks to suborn and manipulate other governments, and that's nothing new in the history of the world. So it's nothing really unique to them, but they need to be called out for it. So
that's right. So thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. Good night.